Okay, so yes, these are the three reports, one of which was totally Marinized because it was the Marine and 25-year Environment Plan. And the two other reports that I want to mention in this talk, which one is about nature-based interventions, and the other one is our response to the progress of the 25-year Environment Plan. And I'm going to start with the one in the middle, the Marine and the 25-year Environment Plan, because this is where we started to make some recommendations about marine and where marine should come in. And I mentioned some of these recommendations this morning. I think really for marine, we need this holistic approach to protect and grow our marine natural capital. And there are lots of benefits from that. And at the moment, most of the actions that are taken are in relation to protected areas. And I'm sort of rather taking the assumption that most of my audience today is actually terrestrially based. So I'm afraid I'm going to try and marinize you all a bit today with largely some pictures of things that make you start to realize just how diverse but also important the marine environment is. So here we have quite a lot of carbon capture going on with kelps, but also with salt marshes. The salt marshes and the kelps also help with flood defence and regulation. Our overseas territories have a lot of coral reefs, so they're still very relevant to UK waters and to UK management targets. These environments have a wealth of biodiversity, from things that we think are quite iconic, to things that we eat, to things that we didn't realise how beautiful they are, unless you're somebody who does go and engage with the marine environment as a diver or as a snorkeler or goes rock pooling, and then you start to realise just how much there is out in the marine environment. And that provides us with a lot of benefits. There's the huge increase in energy, renewable energy that we're seeing. There's aquaculture, obviously the shipping, but we tend to forget, as we discussed this morning, the huge recreational importance of the marine environment, the blue spaces. So we think about the green spaces, but not so many people are aware that for coastal communities, those blue spaces are really important. And they're also why a lot of people visit the coastal areas of the UK, of England, as well as overseas, is for that recreation, for that leisure, and for that general sense of well-being, of just sitting and being in front of blue spaces, which has huge benefits. So these are really important, that we need to bring in all of these facets into our decision-making and into our policy. And we do have some legislation that we can do that. We can do it with the Marine and Coastal Access Act, because these are where we develop the planning policies and where the licensing decisions are made, as well as thinking about what can we do in addition to the marine protected areas, because the marine protected areas tend to be protected for very specific things rather than for natural capital growth more generally. So they're not targeted at natural capital growth in a way that I think they could be in the future. The marine and terrestrial are intimately connected. What comes off the catchments goes down the rivers and eventually ends up in the coasts and the seas. And similarly, the drivers of change in the marine environment are very, very affected by what goes on land, or basically by the people who live on land. And this schematic sort of just shows you some of the values that we're very aware of, the food values and the energy values, as well as the incomes, which all have our market values that we know about, but we tend to forget about all of these other values. The greenhouse gases, huge amount of greenhouse gas, carbon sequestration locked away in the marine environment, the biodiversity of iconic importance, the recreation and health benefits, and the flood defense benefits. So if you look at this picture, then it is very much more than just the fish that we're talking about for the marine environment. And yet even in the 25-year environment plan, the focus is very much on that food value rather than all of these other values. And that's where I'd like to see things changing, and it's the recommendations that we've made from the committee. And these obviously all have social values. So some of the legislation that's developing is around good environmental stewardship, and with the committee we've looked and sort of said, well, there are things that landowners can do to reduce their impact on the coast, particularly if we think about that drainage from catchments, and that could be part of the environmental land management schemes. But at the same time, there are quite a few marine developers and marine users, and I think there should be some incentivization for those users to enhance their stewardship of the marine environment. One term is greening the grey. So if we're, for example, building renewable energy devices, they can be more biodiversity friendly. They could incorporate aquaculture. They might be magnets for protecting marine life. And potentially they can be quite good places for fishing, sea angling, and other recreational purposes. So there are potential benefits. And these can really come also if we start to think about environmental net gain and apply that to marine activities. It's almost easier to think about environmental net gain in the marine environment than it is biodiversity, because we tend to think about these bigger picture things, even if we don't regulate for them. As I've said, there are a lot of physical and psychological health and well-being benefits. And government could be improving public access and enabling more benefits from the marine environment than it probably does at the moment. There is a huge amount of scientific understanding, and we don't tend to think about it in a natural capital context, although we are increasingly doing so. But we could bring a lot of this scientific understanding in the way that Kathy's talked about terrestrial, about flood management. We have some really great models, but we don't tend to think about them in context of climate regulation and waste regulation services. But we can enhance these, and we can use some of our modelling for thinking about some of where we allow discharges into the sea. We can increase food production with better use of science, improve natural flood defences, and think about how we can enhance the wildlife that people enjoy watching. But also, I think we need to have more effort to think about, if we could get all of this right, what would success look like? What do we actually want from the marine environment? Is it really just fish, or is it all of these other things? And how do we understand and think about the trade-offs that are involved? So the next paper that I want to talk about is the response to the 25-year Environment Plan Progress Report. We divided up assets into biotic assets and abiotic assets. So for marine, this felt like a very strange thing to do, to separate biota off from the physical, chemical characteristics of the marine environment. But we did manage to do it. We thought about the marine asset, the components of the asset, and that's the seawater, the seabed, coastal, as well as the marine and coastal processes. So it is feasible to do this. And we also added on here marine litter. So although it's a pressure, it's very much writ large in the 25-year environment plan for marine. We do have a lot of components and things that we can measure in terms of condition and extent. And you can see some of these here. And this report, we went through many of these measurements trying to find out, well, what data is there? Is it spatially representative? Can we actually see, what trends can we see from it as part of our report? Our overall rating and assessment was that the marine environment is red deteriorating, and that is on the basis of these two things: litter's increasing, some of the coastal waters are not meeting the good ecological status targets, and not all of bathing waters have achieved sufficient status, although there have been considerable improvements. But the key thing was the data didn't allow for much more of an incredibly partial assessment of the extent and condition of these assets. And that was very disappointing. If we look at the assessment, pretty much in all of these, it's basically saying we're lacking in data, of sufficient spatial coverage. There's quite a lot of modelled data, and some of that modelled data is really, really good. Let's not quibble about that. We have some very good modelled data, but we don't necessarily have the underpinning validation of those models to say, yes, this is what is happening at the moment. We're basing that on some good scientific understanding, but we don't have the monitoring that's going on that we need. There are some clear trends going on. Climate-driven change is happening in the marine environment, and it's happening very fast. pH levels are decreasing. There is ocean acidification. We know that's happening. Extraordinarily, although there is actually a lot of carbon in the marine environment, in the water column, in the sediment, in the primary production that takes place, we don't actually have enough data to assess the role of marine environment in that, you know, how that role is changing over time. Is it getting better? Is it getting worse? We know it happens and we know the extent to which it happens, but we don't know if it's improving or not. Again, surprising lack of targets in the marine environment. We need more targets, but we do have enough to know that warming seas are really affecting UK coasts and seas. Climate change is happening. So we had a lot of recommendations, largely around that. Although there are challenges, we do still have to seek mechanisms to actually do monitoring, to get better understanding. We need to address those data gaps, and Kathy talked in detail about how you prioritize those data gaps, but also how you start to address them. I probably won't go into too much detail here. We do need to set targets. So most of our targets are for marine protected areas, but there's a huge amount of sea that is not protected. And those marine protected areas haven't been protected with the idea of natural capital and looking after our natural capital and growing it in mind. Therefore, I think we have to think beyond the marine protected areas. We have to go beyond that current focus on MPA condition, marine protected area condition, if we are going to improve the marine environment. So said organic carbon should be a priority. There are indicators that the cycle in the system is changing, but we don't have the data to really be able to say so. 55% of carbon is in, biogenic carbon is in the marine environment. We don't call it biocarbon in the same way that people do terrestrially, but there is a huge amount of carbon there. And as I say, we need to take a much more systems approach to monitoring the environment. If we start to work out how to monitor it properly, then we also can start to work out how to prioritize and reduce future monitoring needs. And I think this is where the baseline census is really important, that we really consider that for the marine as well as for terrestrial. Another area in that report is around biota and asset, the biota asset components, and obviously this includes marine. I just want to highlight that in the biota assets we talked about species which are critical for ecosystem function, that support other flows or ecosystem services. They're rare or iconic or protected species. I just wanted to demonstrate that in the marine environment we do have biota that fulfill all of these, and an awful lot of them, and yet we're not monitoring them. There's very little data. Finally, going to nature-based interventions, this other report, the third one. Again, we've talked about net gain this morning, particularly for marine. I think it's vital that we replace, we actually include net gain, and that it's environmental net gain if we want to think about how we can improve terrestrial and marine ecosystem. There's an awful lot of net zero targets which are going to involve the marine environment, but these need to also be joined up with spatial planning for nature-based interventions. Nature-based interventions are possible in the marine environment. There are a lot of biocarbon stocks, as I've said. I'm just going to give one example, which is the kelp forests. Kelp forests, as they grow and as they degrade, export carbon offshore into the seabed and then further off into the deep sea. But at the same time, these kelp forests are really important for food. They act as a nursery for food fish species. They're recreational importance. So we need to think about it in beyond just the carbon that those forests and that the marine environment provides. And the marine environment also gives us an opportunity to think not just about mitigating greenhouse gases by bringing more carbon into the system, the natural system, but also about adapting to future climates, particularly in terms of flood and storm defence. And again, in this report, we mentioned that monitoring programmes for marine are pretty inadequate. So this is a recurring feature of the Natural Capital Committee, is that we need to do more on getting better marine data. So finally, I've given a skip through these three reports from the Natural Capital Committee, and it is the Natural Capital Committee, not the MTU Atoll Capital Committee's publications. Please do have a look at these, and there's so much more on that website, and a lot more of it now includes marine or has been marinized. So I'm really pleased that I've had the opportunity to come onto the Natural Capital Committee and try and marinize some of the really fantastic work that it's done. Thank you.